Greetings, everybody. Nonymous here from TPLA HQ. I am joined by two of our council members, Ben Judkins and Jared Miracle. And we are chatting here today from our various places of lockdown about various things of martial arts and the things that we do here. So we thought we'd let you in on a little bit of that discussion. Now, we'll start off with a little kind of introduction with people. You all know me. You know I come from a Chinese background. Ma Shi Tongbai is my art, that kind of thing. But you probably don't know so much about the other gentlemen here. So why don't we go alphabetically, and we'll take Ben here. How about where are you coming from in all of this?
Well, my martial arts background in particular, like I think a lot of people, I started off in Taekwondo when I was in middle school, high school, up through college, actually. I studied in multiple different schools and approaches and that. I kind of fell out of martial arts when I got into graduate school because suddenly, I was reading constantly. And I really came back to the martial arts when I was a young professor at the University of Utah. I got really into Wing Chun. And kind of the culture of Southern Chinese martial arts more generally. I was really kind of taken by the differences that I saw in how movement happened there than in Korean and Japanese arts. And I, poured a lot of time and effort into that. And I eventually ended up an instructor in the Ip Ching lineage of, the Ip Man version of Wing Chun. And so that was kind of my main martial arts background. That's what I consider to be my home at this point.
Very good. And we'll move over to Jared, Dr. Miracle, as it were.
I am a superhero at this point. Well, let's see. Like Ben and most people, I imagine in the U.S., I started off as a kid doing Taekwondo. That was maybe a little different than a lot of people's experiences because the instructor there was K. Young Chai, who was consultant to more than one country's Olympic teams and a product of the Korean Olympic machines. So he's quite well. If you say Taekwondo anywhere in the eastern half of the U.S., everybody knows who he is. So it was a very, insofar as Taekwondo becomes traditional, it was a traditional introduction to it. And then I ended up moving on to Japanese arts pretty quickly. I grew up, I got involved in Taekwondo or karate and did some kickboxing here and there as a teenager. Eventually landed in, I wanted to do Aikido and Judo, but the only place to do those in Indiana at that time within like my region was at the university gymnasium, which I couldn't get into because I wasn't a university student. And so instead, I ended up joining the only martial arts club that wasn't in the university gymnasium, which was a Bujinkan club. So I did that for a number of years. When I was 17, I was given the opportunity to study at a high school in Japan. So I packed up, left the farm, convinced my parents that I wasn't going to disappear forever. Ended up in Japan, where I started doing Bujinkan, but then quickly moved over into traditional Japanese martial arts. So like older stuff, Koryu mostly. I was on a high school judo team for a while. I did kendo, all the usual Japanese stuff. Then I came back for college. I did various different types of jujitsu and whatnot during college. Went back to Japan ASAP. That's where I really heavily got involved in the old style Japanese martial arts communities. And I continued on with Aikido. I took up boxing and ended up involved in boxing at a professional level for a few years. Did some mixed style fighting. Was a pro wrestler for about a year. That was fun. People say it's not a martial art. Those people have never pro wrestled.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I don't know. That's just kind of been my life ever since.
Yeah, actually, the last thing you said is probably a good kind of segue that we'll get in here. We were talking about a couple of things. I will try to bring us to where we want to start this whole thing here with this. There's often a talk about what is a martial art and what is not a martial art, right? As you said there. And I people will sometimes will like give the really simple thing, which is, oh, it's a system that teaches you how to fight, right? Okay, that sounds okay on the surface, right? But what about archery? Is that not a martial art? You're not fighting with archery. You're shooting somebody from very, very far away, you know. So there, is military strategy a martial art? Is being a general, is being, is learning all that kind of stuff, martial art, which, because that doesn't directly, you're not fighting, right? You're organizing things for fights to happen, sure, but all that. Performance and theater. WWF, pro wrestling, is a perfect example of one of these martial arts that skates this line between entertainment and sport, right? Now, entertainment and sport are very, very closely related anyway, right? Because sport is a form of entertainment. And what is the oldest form of entertainment on the planet? Wrestling, right? I mean, all kinds of it. I mean, it's as universal as anything. But so we get into this thing. So we have something we all sort of agree on, what is a martial art, and then we argue over what we include in this bucket, right? For my point, I think they're all martial art because they're all developing skills for different purposes, true, right? But it's all based on the idea of conflict, right? You're either simulating conflict, training for it, trying to resolve it, human conflict between people, right? Fighting and violence, which we'll get into, that kind of thing. And each of these things has its own set of principles, its own set of things. You can kind of pick this stuff out when you see people doing it, right? A boxer will have a particular type of grace in the ring, in the sport that he's doing, or maybe not. There are some really great boxers who are not graceful at all. They're just sluggers, but that's not the important part of that particular boxing match, that part of it. Whereas you get something like professional wrestling, which we're mentioning there, and that's much of that is not real, right? But it must be constructed to appear real, or maybe not real, believable, right? Plausible, right? Yeah, exactly. It has to look like it hurts, right? It has to look like you're doing something. If the fake punches are too far away from their chin, I mean, the illusion has been ruined, But then, as long, it's the same thing with stage performance, right? When you're saying, nobody who thinks it's not a martial art has never wrestled. The same thing with stage combat. If you're doing stage combat at those higher levels, you're dealing with the same types of injuries, the same risks, often greater, because you're doing things that are simulating things that aren't done anymore. Sword fights and such, probably the only place that you have a risk of actually being run through by a sword is in a play, by accident, so in that sense, stage performers are more real swordsmen than most anybody, because they're the ones risking death, right? I don't know. But anyway, it gets into what something that you, Jared, were talking about a couple nights ago, and what we were talking about here, which you called somatic dialects.
Right.
Right, which are these, well, why don't you explain it?
The idea of somatic dialects comes from early Renaissance, medieval European theater, stage performances. So the general concept is, and this is totally not my idea. If anybody watching this wants to read more about it, you want to pick up Passionate Playgoing in Early Modern England by Alison Hobgood.
We'll put
really,
a link for that.
Okay, great. Fascinating book to read for anybody who is even the least bit interested in theater or athletics. But the idea of you can't always see or you can't always hear what's happening on a stage. You know, now we have microphones and speakers and everything. But if you look at more classical theater, it's very over the top with expression and gesture and movement. You know, a sword fight on a stage in, say, the 16th century is going to be very heavily dramatized because you need to reach the person in the very back of the building, or most of the time in the back of the crowd, right? And she argues, I think very effectively, that all of the expressions portrayed on a stage like that, because you have a limited number of, like, your scope of interaction with other humans is very limited at that point. Now we're watching television and we have music and we see people all over and we live in big cities. But at the time, the number of people you saw in a day was very limited. And so the way that people behaved on stage in a theater had a bigger impact on you as a person, how you behaved and how you spoke and thought and acted. Hence passionate playgoing. You see this enormous passion on stage, you're going to adopt that style in your life in the same way that if you hear a turn of phrase, you unconsciously incorporate it. I heard someone earlier today use the phrase hashtag in spoken conversation. Twitter is responsible for that, right? And so linguistically, we incorporate that into our lexicon and it becomes a normalized part of everyday language. But language, as you were saying earlier, extends way beyond spoken or written word. It's an entire like classification of being almost, existing in certain states, portraying concepts that are not exact. And so somatic dialects do the same thing. You're going to pick things up from the stage and then incorporate that into your being in everyday life. And that ends up happening as much for just conversation or portraying emotion as it does for physical action, and by extension, violent action like we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a thing that comes to mind from my linguistic background, which is the idea of prosody, which are the non-linguistic actions and stuff like that that still impart meaning to your phrases. So as you're watching me talk, I'm using my hand here. My eyes will also go in different places, and those little dances that we do with our body, with our eyes, and all that kind of stuff are there to kind of rope in the listener, right? So that we can kind of see, you know, we're trying to get through to them more than we're saying, you know, in the words, right? So that's what it's bringing up to me, where you have characters that have to portray more than they're saying.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I saw a good analysis the other day of the actor John Krasinski. There's a channel on YouTube called Charisma on Command that's really helpful for analyzing body language. And one of the things he pointed out was when John Krasinski tells a joke, he does it with his entire body, and somehow that makes it funny. So, for instance, in one specific joke, he says, "And then I looked over there," but he doesn't just say it like that. He goes, "And then I looked over there, And for some reason, the audience only cracks up in versions where he does the pantomime of binoculars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let me ask you a question about this, Jared. Do you see difference in this? I assume you were doing your pro wrestling in Japan, is that right?
No, that was in Northern Indiana.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, this is going to destroy my my question. I was going to ask who could perceive somatic dialects in professional wrestling
Oh
between
gosh, yes.
different countries, and then secondarily, if I compare, professional wrestling to quote unquote real martial arts in those same countries, do I see similarities in the somatic dialect that way?
Absolutely. I would argue it's even more pronounced when you look at pro wrestling than most other aspects of life. Because in pro wrestling, we've even somewhat recently, everyone has started using the named styles. The Japanese style of pro wrestling is called strong style. So if you watch, I was just watching AEW last week, and they were talking about a Japanese pro wrestler in the commentary and referred to strong style, which is very different from American style, which is very different from the lucha style. And it's so exaggerated and so pronounced that it's visible even to the audience. And really, if you get into it, there are two different versions of wrestling in every place, because there's also the shoot style. And shoot style is real actual wrestling, right? Like Ken Shamrock came out of shoot wrestling. That's not staged and not preformed. Baz Rutten too. He came out of shoot fighting.
Right. Yeah.
And everybody knows Pancrase and Shuto and other organizations like that. But that's all. That was a group of people stopping and saying, "What if we didn't script our pro wrestling?" That's all that was. They just happened to reach the same conclusions as mixed martial arts. But yeah, absolutely, the different dialectical patterns are so pronounced, and even within like a particular country. In Japan, they tend to focus on which stable someone trained at. So if you see, I don't know,
Sumo then.
oh yeah, they more or less adopted the sumo pattern of training fighters.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the U.S., it's a lot more mixed, but also regionalized. So if you go south, you're going to see a heavier influence from the lucha style of wrestling. Whereas if you go north, maybe more acrobatics. Midwestern wrestling differs a lot from Northeastern wrestling, but that's kind of going away as people travel around and it's becoming more incorporated and televised. In Japan, it's still, to some extent, you'll see more emphasis put on which stable people train at.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Now, where does this all come in? What the hell why are we talking about this? Right. Well, I think it's probably pretty easy to discern if you know anything about what we do here. Because what's happening right now is we're seeing these things kind of form, right? We're seeing kind of like a crucible here in lightsaber, because we're seeing different groups, different rule sets, different ideas of what can be done and what should be done with all of this kind of thing. And people are building up these somatic dialects, or these little physical language things. And yeah, I mean, we're using linguistic terms here and stuff like that. That's metaphorical, but the processes are very similar, because it's a means of communication. And yeah, I mean, there's lots, like you take the FFE rule set, there are actions and stuff like that are going to become common, that are going to become useful, that because as things they may work particularly well, or they may please the audience in a particular way, they're going to get adopted to larger extents and stuff like that. And we see this with all the other groups too. TSL looks different than Lightspeed, and looks different than whatever, and this, that, and the other. And everybody's doing their own thing. Very much like HEMA. and maybe that's our segue to the next bit.
Hmm.
Well, I don't know if we have more to talk about, exactly what a Somatic dialect is. But that would include the way that we, at least in martial arts, if we look at the Somatic dialects in martial arts, the way we incorporate violence into what we do, right? Because was did you talk about that one time where we or no, I think it was somewhere else where we ostensibly, a lot of people talk about martial arts being oh well, we're learning martial arts so that we never have to fight, right?
Mm.
But fight, you know. So there you go. So I don't know. Why don't we throw it over to Ben? Do you have a?
Oh yeah, I think that the first thing that's important for people to realize is that they are when they do their martial art, people get very much hung up on the idea of reality. Reality is a huge marker of authenticity and legitimacy of practice today, and everybody wants what they do to be real, and they can often tell you some variant of it's real because it hurts, right? You know, because it is stressful, because it is painful, because I've invested a lot in it, because I can get smacked in the face, that's how I know that it's real. And so we often don't interrogate that idea of reality, or we just assume that everybody's version of reality is the same as ours. And that actually makes it hard to see these somatic dialects, or makes it hard to see the culture of different groups, right? And so, I mean, you actually started off with a really interesting question, right? So Jared asked, Jared just asserted, professional wrestling, that's a martial art. You brought up archery, right?
Right.
I think anybody today thinks of archery as a martial art. And that's really interesting, again, to ask why, because if I were to go back to 17th century Japan, or 17th century China, or really China up until about 1890, and ask people, what is the most important martial art? Everybody would say archery in China, and a lot of people would still say archery in Japan, though it'd probably be under the sword, right? Because if you were going to get a job in the military, archery is what you did, right? You couldn't pass the imperial military exam in China unless you were a good archer and a good rider. And most martial artists, well, not most, but a lot of martial artists actually made a living coaching people to pass those freaking exams.
Yeah.
There are more books on archery that are published than, fencing and boxing and wrestling put together in Chinese history. I mean, archery is just huge. And so why do we then say that archery is a martial art, even though there's no back and forth, like fisticuffs kind of engagement, hopefully, between archers? Well, I think G. Cameron Hurst, who wrote probably the first real academic-y book on, the history of armed martial arts, lays it out quite nicely. Archery can be a martial art because it has schools. And the schools have bodies of techniques that are socially passed on. And those bodies of techniques are used combatively, and they do stuff, right? But that's what makes you a martial art, is the social aspect of this, right? If you're just, Yoda sitting up on a mountain by yourself and you've got supreme martial skill, but you had no teacher and you have no students, you're not really a martial artist.
Right.
You got to be part of a system, right? You got to have the students to make you a martial artist. So now archery reminds us that, yeah, you know what, you can have things that are really important martial arts without any direct experience of violence at all.
Yeah.
So a lot of what goes on in terms of creating a community identity, whether you want to think of that in terms of somatic dialects, or you want to think of that in terms of, normative behavior, is what are our expectations for what's about to happen, right? So as kind of part of my academic research, I've gone to all of Ludo Sports North American tournaments that have happened, because they're actually like in Elmira, New York, which is pretty close to where I live. So it's sweet. I get to go to them. I was really bummed that they canceled them this year because of COVID-19, but what you going to do, right? And it has been fascinating to watch that organization evolve and see everybody become better at their game, kind of over the years on a technical level, but also the body culture that they express, that they're all starting to look like ludo sport fighters as they get better and better. And that's part of the expectation, is that people are going to move this way, right? And they're going to employ a body of technique, and they're not going to try to smack you upside the head really hard, right? And it's very different than if you were to go to a TSL tournament, which has also been developing its own pretty unique physical culture, a lot of which is based around the sort of armor that they wear and the things that you can do, right? And so you end up with two groups that both spend a lot of time talking about reality, right? But experience it very different, because they kind of create these different closed systems of meaning, part of which is based on expectations. So if we want to be able to understand what goes on in different groups, or the types of communities that we see using lightsabers, one of the things to focus on is, well, what are your expectations for level of violence that's going to happen, right? How much contact is permissible? How much contact is a good thing, right? We all want to be hit. That's why we're going out into the ring. We want to win, but we also want to experience something real, right? We want to feel something. That's part of the joy of competition too. So how do you expect to be hit, right? How hard? Where, right? And it turns out that we have a lot of unstated assumptions about that. And it's probably better to get some of those unstated assumptions out and make them stated, so that we can play together a little bit more reasonably.
Right, exactly. Hence rule sets, right?
And rule sets, yes.
Right. Yeah. Now, rule sets are just one point, one part of it. I mean, that's just, there's all kinds of stuff. Like, we have basically 2 in-house rule sets, but we play around with all kinds of rule sets. We don't care, yeah, it's very much like HEMA. And you were talking about like what the expectations. We want to be hit. We want to expect. We want to know where and all that stuff. We also kind of want to know when. And that sort of brings us to what we were talking about earlier, which is an older video from 2017, which shows a competitor in a HEMA tournament striking his opponent after the ref has ended the engagement, after the point has been called, right? And he does this twice. Flagrantly, yes. It's not you can't say, oh, he just kind of, he didn't hear them. Everything stops, and then bam, once in the head and then once in the back. The back one, as Jared was saying, that's pretty nasty. You don't want to necessarily do that, but yeah. But we were talking about, like, what does that tell us about, well, I mean, I don't know. We would have to do a survey of other things, I see some of that happening. I watch a lot of the swordfish stuff when it goes up, and all that kind of thing. I don't see it happening a lot in those tournaments or whatever. But is this something that is, obviously this is going to be something that's going to come up in sabering, right? We're already talking about it in certain circles. What constitutes excessive force? And that's going to be a different thing, because that's really a subjective call. Do we have any thoughts on that? I'll let anybody pop in on that one, especially in what we're talking about with these dialects and all that kind of thing.
I thought Jared actually brought up a really good point before we got on camera, right? Is this talking about the varieties of sportsmanship? To what extent are groups looking at this as a sport, versus to what degree are people looking at this as a martial art, and we're bringing up concepts of, like, honor, right? And these can lead you to 2 very different places in terms of what will be tolerated or not tolerated, in a group.
And even just, I mean, in terms of group culture, regardless of which social category in which we choose to place something, if this is play or if this is serious, it gets back to that Irving Goffman idea of, like, play can be serious and serious can be play, but at some point one becomes more dominant than the other. Um, but also that we have to start questioning what is going to be considered acceptable and normal behavior, and then how are we going to react to that, because no group culture forms unless there is some kind of group response that encourages or discourages specific behavior. Anecdotally, I've visited, and I'm sure we all have, plenty of martial arts schools where they say, for instance, judo. I went to a judo school one time in Japan. Um, Ben and I have talked about this on occasion. It was an interesting place in terms of group culture. But judo has a very prescribed rule set for the way that they spar, right? And it's the same everywhere in the world. That's why it's an Olympic sport. And so it confused me that night when I was sparring and one of the assistant instructors started implementing techniques that you don't do in judo sparring. I mean, it is anathema. It is, you will get yourself kicked out of a gym for doing some of the stuff he was doing. And I didn't respond in kind. I sort of worked around it, but if we don't call that out explicitly and question what our acceptable boundaries are going to be, then that can lead to more danger than we want. Mm-hmm. And it can also hurt the group's identity. We lose our sense of sportsmanship. It's a good way to have a group fall apart.
Well, yeah, this is what defines groups to begin with, is shared norms, right? So if you don't defend those norms, yeah, you don't have a group.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that is why we as an organization take the positions we do, especially on safety and that kind of thing. Those are always at the forefront. And like you said, it becomes it becomes that quality that identifies you, right? That unspoken thing that everybody everybody can tell. Like you said, like Ludo Sport is starting to gather that up. But you were mentioning like our system is more of a bunch of different somatic dialects kind of coming together. So a different thing, like a diversification of it. And that's what I would like to see. Now, one thing we remember, most of the stuff on the channel is me. So it's going to have that flavor, that somatic dialect that comes from me, from the Chinese stuff and all that kind of stuff, is going to be there, right? You can't assume that stuff is what is important. So you can't say, well, that's just Chinese, this, that. No, well, you can do it in a bunch of different ways. And hopefully, as we move on, we'll see people from different backgrounds doing them, bringing other qualities to them. You can do the same movement exactly the same, completely different. When we're dealing with mechanics and sports medicine and stuff like that, we understand this, that there's no movement is ever repeated twice, like lightning, and yeah, it's like that. Anyway, all right. Shall we start wrapping her up here? Do we have anything else to?
I would just emphasize that, rule sets are important, but when you're creating and reinforcing the community, it's a lot of the stuff that happens beneath the surface. Like you said, the unstatedness, right? And so you want to think very carefully about, what do you see? What do we see in our schools? What do we want to encourage? What kind of feelings do we want people to have? What kind of experience do we want them to have in class? Because those feelings that you build there, they're the ones that people are going to take with them when they go outside. They're going to take them to the tournaments. That's what's really going to end up defining the kind of martial artist, the kind of person that you become down the road.
Yeah. And it's a double-edged sword too, because that's also the way people, get people to come to them, So you can be fooled by that too. So you have to be, it's a balance you have to take. But it's very, yeah, I mean, it's very important that you pick up on these things and then do with them what you will.
It makes me think of the classic dichotomy established in the Karate Kid. You know, Mr. Miyagi points out this is two different dialects competing with each other. No bad student, only bad teacher. Teacher say, student do.
Right.
So it's all the more important that any group leader is establishing not only precedent, but behaving in a way that they want everyone to be behaving. Personal comportment is extremely important.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Leading by example is often the only way, you know, because people tend to just do what's being done around them, right? Most people, especially new people, they come into a group, they're first very concerned about, okay, what do I do to fit in here, you know? And if you put those things that you find as to be most important there, out in front of everybody, then those new people know exactly, okay, those are the touchstones that we have to resonate with. And like you said, it's a safety issue too. So everybody's on the same page, right? So you don't get a situation like your judo one, where one person is doing wildly, sometimes considered illegal for whatever sport you're in. Like if you were going to go and you're doing collegiate wrestling, you know, and one person's doing Greco-Roman, the other one's doing
Freestyle.
Yeah. Right? You know, it's like, wait, what? You know, so anyway, all right. Do we have any final thoughts to leave everybody with, or I think that was a pretty good discussion. We're going to try to have more of these here. I'll try to assemble a different panel. We'll keep them a little smaller so we don't talk over each other so much, and everybody gets a chance to say something. But anyway, thank you for tuning in. We will see you next time. Patience, practice, perseverance. Happy sabering.